Hello and good evening, I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know about the news of the day. Tonight on the show, we're going to be focusing on how the COVID-19 pandemic is a magnifying glass for inequality. Now, global human development is measured as a combination of the world's education, health and living standards. New estimates from the UNDP show that global human development is now on course to decline this year for the first time since the concept was developed in 1990. And this decline is expected to be across the majority of countries, rich and poor, in every region. Niloy Banerjee is the United Nations Development Programme resident representative for Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei. He joins us on the show tonight. Welcome, Niloy. Let's talk about how this pandemic is different from other crises in how it's impacted human development. I mean, going back to the 1990s when this global human development concept was first developed, I mean, in that 30 years since, Niloy, there's been many other crises. So why is this crisis, the one that's causing the largest reversal in human development on record?
Thank you, Melissa and Sharad. Before I respond, I just want to take a minute to say, particularly since the MCO, but even before that, I've been following your conversations on considering this, and I think you're providing a very valuable space.
Oh, thank you.
For some of these conversations to surface. So thank you very much for that. And,
because thank you for watching us.
So just look, you're absolutely right. We've been measuring human development since 1990, and there have been short-term reversals, but this is different because it's quickly morphed into such a multidimensional crisis. It's gone from what was purely a health crisis to a much, much bigger socioeconomic crisis. Now, what that does, I know, Melissa and Sharad, you're very familiar with the human development concept, but for your viewers, quick recap, the Human Development Index is a composite index, which primarily builds on the pillars of income, per capita income, health, and various sub-parameters of that, and education and various sub-parameters of that. So now what happens is the perfect storm. Whereas, you know, for instance, global per capita income is down 4% or so. Health indicators will definitely go down because there have been now about 360,000 deaths. And then there are sort of secondary health impacts, including impacts, socioeconomic impacts, such as wiping out of savings, etc. And then comes the more sort of intractable issue, because the numbers on this are still need a few more months to get the numbers on this. You know, as education moved to distance education or e-education or moved online for the last month of movement control, we have a serious problem because the digital divide will ensure that millions of children, and we are just looking at very preliminary data, who don't fall on the right side of the digital divide, whose household incomes don't allow a sort of digital infrastructure at home. So this schooling delivered online has essentially meant for them dropping out. And of course, you know, even the wider infrastructure at home, which is having some private space or a study or a library to do your studies, to do your education. So this is a very, very big impact. So when you combine all of them, we are indeed seeing for the first time, and very sadly for us, a reversal in human development after 3.5 decades. And that's so concerning for us. Malaysia also will be a microcosm of that bigger global phenomenon.
Yeah, Niloy, if we could get a little more granular on some of the dynamics that you kind of described here. When you look at, say, death in the 3 countries that you overseas, Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei. I understand that both Malaysia and Singapore have had actually very low death rates when it comes to the COVID pandemic, at least per capita. Do you see much more nuance in the picture? So the global picture might be grim, and statistically, but are there bright spots or spots that perhaps are less affected by the COVID pandemic?
Indeed. Malaysia's, we are fortunate that the hit on actual death is, in relative terms, of course, no death is short of a tragedy, but in relative terms, Malaysia's the impact is less. But Charles, it's the secondary impact of a growing health crisis, which is both macroeconomic expenditures to the health sector, which will need to be found from somewhere, but also at the level of households, the increase in A, health expenditure, but B, also looking at issues of lost income and therefore impact on ability to spend on health. Right. So that's where the impact is indeed more granular and more nuanced in some countries.
Okay. I want to ask you also, Niloy, about about COVID and multidimensional poverty, which is something that the UNDP has worked on for quite a while. I'm wondering whether the public health response, particularly in the countries that you are resident representative in, whether that's taken into account the deprivation profiles of those living in multidimensional poverty, and not just those that fall within, say, the monetary measurement of a poverty line.
Precisely, only at the gross for instance, in Malaysia, the B40 category level, but right. Within that, it has not. We are not just as an intellectual community. We are not at the level where we have fully figured out the multidimensionality of these issues, and the biggest. Exemplar, I think, is the digital inequality. I mean, many of us just seamlessly transitioned into the digital, working from home, or buying food from home, or doing our almost 80% of our business continuity. It just continues without any disruption. But there you are. There is a whole host of the population that's digitally falling behind because there is no access to the right infrastructure. Broadband penetration is getting very, very variegated among nations first and then within nations. Okay. The ability to do any kind of, conduct any kind of business, even we're seeing that for the small and medium enterprise sector here, they were not very digitized. And, so they have taken such a hit on their revenue stream. Okay. If it was a seamless transition for them into an e-commerce kind of an environment, I think it would have been a much smaller hit. But now, so yes, the multidimensionality of poverty has not yet been very well understood by us, by the community at large. It's not just the Malaysia, Singapore, or Brunei issue, where again, as I said before, that. Children who are growing up in what we would call less than decent living conditions, which is one of the deprivations on which the multidimensional index is based. If you don't have a room to do your lessons, if you don't have broadband to access the lessons, you are already falling behind right. in many ways.
I think that's important. We're going to take a quick break, but let's continue this conversation. Many things that you brought up there, I want to delve deeper in. So let's continue this conversation with Niloy in just a few minutes. Stay with us right here on Consider This. If you've just joined us, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, with me, Sharad Khatun. We're speaking tonight to Niloy Banerjee, UNDP resident representative for Malaysia, Brunei and Singapore. Now, Niloy, you were talking about education and the digital divide just before the break. It was a great point that you brought up. And I'm looking at a release recently by the UNDP estimating that with school closures, the effective out-of-school rate, meaning the percentage of primary school-aged children without internet access and no continuing educational activities, your estimates indicate that 60% of these children are not getting an education. Now, these are global levels you claim have not been seen since the 1980s. I'm wondering, Niloy, if these reversals are permanent because, the progress that's been made in the last 30 years through SDGs and MDGs, has that all been undone?
It hasn't been undone in totality, Melissa, because there are, always in such a crisis, there is the gold vein, the silver lining, but the hit on education. Look, you can guess it's South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where most of these numbers are coming from. It's the equivalent of a school dropout. If it's the equivalent of a school dropout, then early education dropout is a double whammy because, as as we had said in our human development report last year, that in the modern world, the cognitive skills we need, the vocabulary size that we need, all of this builds right from day one, long before you stepped into school for the first time. The home environment, degree of education among the parents. So that's the first whammy for many children. And now having to drop out of school, missing the incentives, for example, like school feeding programs that also had a knock-on benefit on nutrition, etc. These are all potentially, yes, endemic, that it would settle into a generation. Hopefully it doesn't have to, because it can be reversed. Policy can be designed with a broader equity lens, with more empathy, and policy can be designed with much more multidimensionality in mind. And
Niloy, if I could just interject at this point, I mean, is that the situation that attends for Malaysia? Malaysia not being like many sub-Saharan African countries or other third world countries, are we likely to see school dropouts at the rates that you're seeing in other countries, especially those disadvantaged, generally? Or are we going to see, in fact, it's been like a 3-month summer holiday for a lot of kids. They're coming back to school now, and we see the staggered move to have them come back. Are we going to see basically the schools fill up as they did before the crisis?
I hope not, Sharad. I really hope this was indeed the vacation, in which case I need one as well. But I hope they can come back seamlessly, and I hope for sure that we don't see a resurgence of this necessarily the social distancing disease, because, as you know, there is some conversation going on in the scientific community that this is not the end of it, and just common sense tells us the flu comes back every year in some of the countries I've lived in before. So,
yeah, Niloy, I do want to ask you about this, right? Again, and I'm struck by the fact that you covered not just Malaysia, but Singapore and Brunei. Brunei being oil-rich, Singapore being extraordinarily affluent, that different countries and different national contexts might be able to bounce back much better. How do we locate Malaysia's capacity to bounce back or to recover vis-a-vis other countries? Should we be comparing ourselves to a Brunei or Singapore, or should we be comparing ourselves to a Thailand or, a European country? How should we locate Malaysia's specific capacities and conditions?
I think, Sharad, as you know, there's some parameters, of course, compare with Thailand, some parameters compare with Singapore, some others compare with Brunei. Now, the question is, Bounce back indeed possible. The big challenge is the economy and jobs. Particularly the small and medium micro enterprise sector. The other big challenge is, reimagining social protection, because we saw that the swathes of the population that are not technically poor by definition, and they have had a slide back because they were not able to access their workplaces. So, given the right macro framework, given the right stimulus push points, I don't think a bounce back is impossible, but the bounce back needs to be designed carefully. We just don't want to march into a sector by sector bounce back, a myopic bounce back mindset here.
Okay, well, speaking about bouncing back, I want to touch on the things that we have regressed, and I'm hoping that we will bounce back. Gender equality, Niloy. The COVID-19 pandemic seems to be deepening some pre-existing gender inequalities, especially in unpaid care work, domestic work, for an example. Do you think that we can address that? This is an opportunity for us to address this, or have we regressed in terms of the gender equality, leaps that we've made in recent times?
Precisely, there is immense opportunity to bounce back and bounce back much better. Build forward better, build for the future better. Because here's this moment in time when we can take a little pause and say, well, how would I do this differently this time around? And this is not just only for gender, Melissa, I submit. This is also for climate-friendly, a more green bounce back. I submit this is also for a more digitally equal bounce back. If you just take gender and unpaid care, exactly. If we had in our next design, if we could say, well, let us work on a digital framework where much more non-traditional actors, such as women, and in Malaysia, highly educated women who are not in the labor force for various reasons that we are aware of, could they be plugged into the digital economy? Could e-commerce become a much more a thriving avenue for productive utilization of the labor of these women who are not part of the labor force and providing unpaid aid work? Can gig economy become much more mainstream through proper enabling framework and incentives?
Okay.
Could small and medium enterprises, which employ large numbers of women, could they be more plugged into the whole e-commerce platform? So there's many ways to bounce back better from this. Oh, and I want to mention telecommuting policy. If we did have, and we all found out to our surprise, that telecommuting does work. I mean, it's worked for me in UNDP. It's worked for my colleagues. I have 250 colleagues in UNDP in Malaysia. It's worked for all of them. So, good telecommuting gives women that much more space to have to fulfill some of their family obligations, but also continue to participate in the formal economy.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Let's come back to this conversation and discuss how to reimagine a world post-COVID-19. More with Niloy Banerjee in just a few minutes. Stay tuned to consider this. Thanks for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Lisa Idris with me, Sharad Kutan. Let's continue our conversation with Niloy Banerjee, the UNDP resident representative for Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei. Coming back to something you said about bouncing back, with gender equality, bouncing back, green bounce back, digital bounce back, everything you talked about, Niloy, about this being an opportunity for e-commerce, an opportunity for telecommuting, all of that requires you being, to use your words, on the right side of the digital divide. What happens if there is unequal access to technology, and that is going to have a sizable effect on how communities deal with the impact of this COVID-19 pandemic? How do we resolve that inequality?
Like with all inequalities, Melissa, we have to now take a very hard look at where our social protection systems, let's face it, we are all in this together, where our social protection systems lie. Did we have unemployment insurance for daily wage workers? I'm seeing some numbers for the hit on the agriculture sector, which is, again, primarily informal, very, very low-end salary-wise, pay-wise. Did we have enough risk insurance for small and medium enterprises? Are we doing enough for our vulnerable and marginalized by way of social protection? Look, a very good time to take a hard look at what used to be only income and wealth inequalities. But look, other inequalities are rising. Food prices have crept up, as you know, not again so much in Malaysia, but globally supermarket food prices have been up. Again, creates a nutritional inequality, digital inequality. So we have to take a hard look at how we are taking care of our vulnerable. Some parts of UNDP have really looked at, are actually looking through now this possibility of the universal basic income, whether that is one way to reimagine social protection.
Niloy, I want to jump in here and ask you, like the World Health Organization, I guess the UNDP is a member state-driven type of organization. You might provide guidelines and suggestions, but there's no compulsion on member states to take any of this up. What are the chances that if a country and its political system was not addressing issues of gender inequality, digital divide before the crisis, that they will do so now that the crisis has kicked in? I mean, what political will is there to actually address these large problems that you pointed out?
Two sides to the political will, Sharad. In fact, it's a very good question, and it doesn't have to be, some of the biggest member states are actually showing a withdrawal from the multilateral and collective action system. Withdrawal from WHO, Paris Climate Agreement. Look, why now? Because the vulnerability of from the mightiest to the tiniest is up on display. It's been a stunning crisis of a proportion we've not seen before. How it quickly impacted almost every country, every typology of country around the world. But also, in many ways, it shows that some of this is transboundary. So there's a need for collective action. We are all very vulnerable. And I think some collective action has been shown. I mean, I'm very impressed, having lived in countries with a lot more sort of social socially disobedient people, that, when the leadership of Malaysia made emotional appeal to social distance, to restrict themselves during activities of the holy month, people by and large listened. So there is, I think, the collective action problem is the collective action is not as dead as the cynics would sometimes have. Right. But yes, multilateralism is under challenge. But to the heart of your question, I think this COVID thing has shown how common our problems are and how vulnerable we all are.
Okay.
And therefore, the presence of global norms, which member states determine, you're absolutely right, the presence of global SOPs. I mean, by and large, despite all the finger pointing and bickering, for the COVID response, almost most countries have followed an SOP, the distancing, the contact tracing, the prevention, the cure, or the search for the cure. So it's been so there is a value for setting global SOPs and these, therefore organizations that have soft power, the power of suggestion, as you say. But maybe this time we are learning something from this.
Okay, so Niloy, on that note of perhaps a human development perspective on how we've been responding to COVID-19 and how we're hoping to exit from the impact of this pandemic, how will the UNDP encourage countries like Malaysia, societies within Malaysia, to act on these lessons that we've seen? The magnifying glass that this pandemic has focused on inequalities here. What will the UNDP do?
At the level of principles, we would strongly recommend that we first use a strong equity lens. Second, we look at human capabilities. We are now understanding that the basic capabilities, the early childhood survival, getting a decent primary education, are well and good. But because the crisis is a layer on to already unresolved issues, the haves and have-nots, the people versus planet, that we now look at also enhanced capabilities and invest in those. Like, people need to be digitally savvy and have the digital infrastructure, and we need to find public resources for these investments.
Right.
We need to look at quality education.
Can I ask you, Niloy, very quickly before we end the show, it's at the top of the show, I said that we're seeing reversals not seen in 30 years for global human development. How long do you think it will take us to reverse these reversals, get back to where we once were?
I don't have a crystal ball. I would have bought the lottery ticket if I could. But I think it really depends on how we design the recovery. For instance, if we design the recovery back to a brown economy, which is very tempting, almost intuitive, I don't think we are doing ourselves any favor. So you're seeing the conversation in France, for example. The stimulus is being used to encourage Air France to reduce its carbon footprint and to encourage the population to start taking trains much more than short-haul flights, for example. Right. Now, this is a great move. 15, 20 years, we could see a significant reduction in the footprint of carbon. So, Melissa, I don't have a how long answer, but I have a how answer.
Okay, well, that's good enough for me. Thank you so much, Niloy, for speaking to us tonight. We appreciate your time and you sharing your insights with us.
And good luck with your soft power.
That's all the time we have for you tonight on this edition of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.